Welcome, good evening, everyone, or good morning, or good afternoon, or good night, whatever the time zone you're in. Welcome to this next meetup, part 2 of the UX, DDD and BDD. Today I've rewatched some of the last session and it's blown my mind again. So I'm pretty happy that we're all here together again discussing this interesting topic. As always, for the people who are already in Zoom, you can raise your hands and you can join this virtual coffee. And for the people just watching, lay back, sitting there, just ask questions on any chat. So that's YouTube or Zoom or even on Slack, and we'll pitch you in. But let's first do an introduction again. So I'm going to start at my top right corner, which is Rebecca.
Oh no, okay.
Yeah.
I was just logging into the Miro board as you did this. Yeah, I'm Rebecca Wurzbach. Been involved in design topics since early object-oriented days. Invented something called responsibility-driven design, which, and also the conversational form of use cases. I'll throw in another tidbit of history there. But anyway, deeply interested in the intersection of usability, design, and observable behavior of systems, as well as behavior that makes things happen that are observable. So there we go.
Good. So next up is Jabe on the other side.
Hey guys, I'm Jabe. I am at the Global Transformation Office at Red Hat, and I'm also getting my PhD at Carnegie Mellon. I study all sorts of different variations of design. One of my favorite things that I work on is called transition design, which has to do with large-scale, long time frame design, trying to figure out how to design or change social organizations into more sustainable systems. I'm excited to be here and see everybody again. Hi, guys.
So for me, next up is Jessica on my screen.
Good morning. I'm Jessica Kerr. I am a semathicist, I like to say, which is a active participant in learning systems made of learning parts, such as every software team.
Good. Dawn, you're up next.
So hi, I'm I guess a bit of a chameleon and a jack of all trades, if you like. I'm a design principal, which is general troublemaker, asking odd questions, and a front-end architect, but have been a technical architect building data centers in a previous life. And now I focus on designing and creating software that will meet the needs of users, and also solving some of these hard problems that we have where we're designing systems for a large amount of people, but people are not a monolith. So really focusing on the human at the center of the problem. So that's what I do, or try to do at least.
We all do. Matt, you're up next.
Quick, find the mute button. Yes, my name's Matt Wynn. I was one of the early adopters of and then members of the core team for Cucumber, which is an open source tool for running business readable acceptance tests. So it's a BDD tool. So I'm like an XP practitioner, a test-driven developer by trade. And yeah, I'm into that movement, that community, because as a programmer, I want to be building software that matters. And it's very important to me that if we want to invest effort in designing good object-oriented, well-architected systems, that we're building things that are important, and that involves figuring out what it is that the software is supposed to do and who it's supposed to do it for. So all of this work about understanding who our users are and what they want, and then transforming that into the models in the code, is what I'm fascinated by, really, so that we can go and do all that good craftspersonship work.
Thanks. And last but not least, John, you're up.
Yeah, I'm John Smart. What Matt said, really, Matt summed it up really well, why you do BDD. So I'm into helping teams to work together to collaborate more effectively. So I wrote this book called BDD in Action, which I think might be behind me. And I do a lot of work with teams teaching collaboration techniques, in particular getting testers out of their silos and into actually doing real agile practice, what I call proper agile practices, and helping testers become more effective at doing their job. So that's feels a little bit limiting, but when you do it, it's very satisfying.
Good, thanks. So last time we spoke a lot about, well, the basics, a bit about UX, what's DDD, what's BDD. We spoke a bit about the three cultures and how all these practices relate. And we have some topics up. So shall we just pick up the first topic of Matt? So Matt, maybe you can explain the one about ubiquitous language and bounded context, because I really like that question.
Yeah, so as I understand it, and I'm not I'm from, BDD was inspired by domain-driven design. I've read a couple of books about domain-driven design, but I wouldn't call myself an expert. But my understanding is that the definition of a bounded context is that it's a linguistic boundary. It's where we that idea of a ubiquitous language. It's the area in the solution space where we can use consistent terminology. And I wondered how that translates to the world of UX, and because it's a solution spacey thing, but it's also, we're thinking about the language that we use. So we want to ideally try and map it to a domain in the problem space. So yeah, that's my puzzle. How to bound map to UX? Is there a similar concept in UX or?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Jessica.
Okay, I was going to say that's a tricky one because there's a lot of applications that might be like written by different teams, and you'd think they don't have a dependency on each other, but in fact they're coupled by having the same users. So like the concepts are coupled that way.
I would say that at one end, and I would be curious to see what you say about this, Jabe. We looking at a problem from a design concept, you start with needs. So you don't actually even have the problem statement. So you have to start with, I need this, and then you almost have to do a sort of translation and transposition to say, okay, that translates to, the classic is the Henry Ford quote, right? If you'd ask people what they wanted, they would tell you they wanted faster horses. He was designing a car. So normally how I've approached this both ways, because it's a bridge, is the users don't necessarily tell you, they will categorically tell you what they don't want. They won't necessarily give you the positive of what they do want. And we come with a lot of assumptions and terminology and coded language. So we always start what we call it's effectively a glossary, where we put everything together, but we build that every time because everybody's different, every team is different, every project is different. And then it stops all the arguments about whose term is better, but rather let's agree to what this means. And then we take that list, and part of our user research is that we test that with card sorting and a bunch of things to try and mind read. So if I said X to you, what would that invoke? And then we can take that as feedback, because that most people don't actually understand what that means. That might be a good thing, because if it's ambiguous, then people will stop and ask, and you give people an opportunity to ask a stupid question without looking stupid. Or we take that back and figure out how we can simplify it and make that closer to our users or our person who we're trying to build a solution for, their mental model, or figure out that we're going to have to introduce a new aspect. So that's how that's how I solve that problem. I don't assume that anybody's going to know what I'm actually talking about, but I have the luxury of working in a space where that's accepted.
So Rebecca, I see you want to
Yeah. It's interesting when you think about, we talked about bounded contexts in domain-driven design as being an area of which in the business, you have the same concepts mean the same things. That doesn't mean we start out by knowing that those concepts mean the same things. In fact, we have to have discussions about, well, what is the language we use? Because even as, there might be different sets of users, and I'm trying to avoid the word persona, but different sets of people interacting with the system that have slightly different nuances for terminology. But within this whole area, we agree that accounts mean this thing, or that when something is late means this, or, so you have to come to an agreement of what the terminology is. It seems to me that when I have done this sort of language hunting and modeling, that even at the point of the user experience, that there's a difference between different roles and their perception, I'm going to say personas, of how they're interacting with that same domain. So it isn't just that I have one big, domain and everybody thinks about it the same way that's interacting with it. So I want to push that out to the UX folks and say, well, we might talk about accounts this way, or we might talk about something being late, or we might talk about this, but you still have to divide it up into the models that the users' various different roles have.
Yeah. Can I ask a question there? Because so I dive into some anthropology, and they talk about emic and ethic, right? Where emic says nothing has meaning from itself. So that means if you divide bounded context on language, that is not possible when you're in that space, because a word doesn't have meaning yet. So how can you split it? Is that a bit relational? Is that a relation to what UX researchers do? Try to, nothing has meaning of itself and just observe what's there to start with?
I would say a couple things. First of all, I always try to convince people that design is an activity where you are not fitting a thing that you're making into a pre-existing mental thing. You're actually modifying people's behavior. That's what design does. Design modifies people's behavior, modifies their language. You're changing the world when you are creating a designed object. And there's high resistance ways of doing that and low resistance ways of doing it. So low resistance ways would be kind of trying to figure out if there's already a common language around something and then adopting that language and moving through. And a high resistance way would be like, no, I'm going to really actually teach you something completely new. So I think about things like when you first used Photoshop, especially if you didn't actually start using Photoshop way back in the day before I had this long gray beard, it's a completely different experience, right? Like now you have to be trained in understanding the metaphors, the ideas, the theories that go behind everything that's happening in Photoshop. Otherwise you have no clue what's happening, right? And I think people really fail to understand this to a great extent, especially software people, because they think everything feels so natural for them. But studies of things like the digital divide point this out really quickly. If you take someone who has never used a piece of software before, has never used a computer before, and you expose them to a piece of equipment like a PC, software engineers think, oh, well, when they have access to that, for instance, in a library, then they can just go use it to do things like find a job. But the answer is it takes, on average, about 2 years for people to understand the basic metaphors that we use in software engineering. And I'm talking about like folders and trash cans and things like that. Things that seem very obvious to us are not very obvious to people who haven't been already kind of engaged in this behavior, right? So anyway, that's one thing. The second thing I'd say is that I agree with Dawn that card sorting and activities like this are an attempt to start to understand how much we need to change the people's behavior in order for them to understand the software that we're building, right? So it's like a way of measuring the resistance to what we're proposing. I don't think that's always how it's portrayed in UX theory, right? In UX theory, it's often portrayed like, what do we need to change on our software side to make it more acceptable? But I think it's like a measure of resistance. And then the last thing I would say, just kind of, well, I have two more things. One is that I think that in kind of a anthropological or ethnographic way, the way you would explore what Matt wanted to explore is what's called grounded research. And grounded research is simply a way of like reading a literature and noticing common terminology and then linking those terms together in a way that says, I think that this is actually a model that emerges from the literature. I didn't come up with it. It came from the literature. And it's a more constructivist way of kind of thinking through how one might research these things. And, you know, for most people out there, it's doing a bunch of interviews, recording them, transcribing them, and then noticing very common terminology, and then trying to link those terminologies together is maybe the first way that one would start, for instance, creating a list that would go into a card sorting activity or something like that. And then the only last thing, like, and I don't know if other people have other things they want to talk about in this topic, but to go all the way back to Jessica's first statement, I think one of the interesting things to talk about would be common ground versions of these domains. And what I mean by common ground are the way in which multiple domains eventually have to touch each other, and what is the minimal amount of interconnection that's required in order for people to comprehend across domains as opposed to in domains. So like if we're worried about the relationship between words in domains, how do we actually think through kind of the bounded context that is a meta level of that, right? So, and in resilience engineering, we refer to this concept as common ground. And what we would explore there is the idea, almost the opposite of bounded context, where it is not an attempt to make everyone get on the same page. It's an attempt to create a minimal set of vocabulary that allows one to move from one domain to another. And I think that's an interesting way to play with what we're talking about right now.
So I have an observation about this because I've been reading mythologies and by basically saying myth is a type of speech, and getting to the fact that imbuing meaning, I hope, Jabe, you don't mean least common denominator, common ground, because then we'd all be speaking pidgin or
exactly
something.
right.
We couldn't express what we need to do.
Yeah.
So I tend to think that if we want to have understanding across domains in a business sense, maybe we have to recognize that at certain touch points that the language needs to be translated, that there may not be much common ground. Even our understanding of what a customer is might be very different across, the domains. So, I mean, that sounds sad, but I tend to think it would be nice if it were more, but I'm not optimistic about that.
I agree. And like, I think for a lot of people out there who might be doing things around like, the way I term this is recommoning data, but like aggregating data across multiple parts of their business. So like I have a bunch of silos in my business that have siloed data, different applications, and now we're gonna try to create a common customer record. I think one of the naive ways of going about that is to declare that you can create a master record of the customer and then force everyone to use it. And this never works. It doesn't work well. And so this common ground idea and these domain ideas have to do with the benefits of both sides of that and how we get them to interact a little bit, I think is really interesting. And I think, there's something in here too about so it's in my work, it's the difference between universal and pluriversal concepts of the world. So a universal concept is eventually everything comes to a point. We can all agree eventually that that X means one. In a plural versor world, there's no convergence. It doesn't converge. There's multiples, right? And we've already kind of talked a little bit about like the concept of multiple customers or multiple users, multiple ways of expecting the software to be interacted with. But also we have this other multiple, which is multiple domains inside of our business interacting with these multiple different types of users, so that we end up with the question ends up being like, how do we kind of come to a medium, which is like not trying to oversimplify those things like you were pointing at, Rebecca, but also not allowing them to become so broadly defined that we don't have any way of kind of coming to a common agreement on anything. So it's like a weird balance between those two ideas that I think is interesting.
I got someone who wants to ask a question. I'm going to promote him to panelist for now, because I think he can join in since, well, let's see if he... Eric, are you here? He should be.
You're muted, Eric.
I've never heard of him.
No. So Eric,
okay.
There he is.
Yeah.
Hi.
I think it was
he
you
wants to
that
pitch
had
in.
me muted, by the way.
Everyone's muted at the start.
Yeah.
Welcome. So
Thank you.
you wanted to, you raised your hand. So I guess I'll just make you panelist and you can join in the conversation.
Yeah, it's just this discussion of like, how do you represent, like, how do you look at the language that spans the different bounded contexts, and this universalist plural versus, getting my tongue tangled up, but I think that's a very interesting thought. And the more, limited kind of ambition that Rebecca was talking about, I think that's kind of a lot of what I think we need to say is, let's start with things we actually can do and not aspire to things that don't really reflect the way people communicate. But there was one specific thing I wanted to add in, which is I've seen cases where people think of it as just a way to exchange between, say, this context and that one, and we've got these people who specialize in this area and these people who specialize in that area, and we need enough common language or enough translation ability to let them talk to each other. And that's a common case, but sometimes I've found that what's really happening is that there's a new sort of subdomain emerging at the intersection of these two things, that suddenly people have an insight into how these two relate to each other that is itself a whole new subdomain to explore, so that then we kind of try to fit it into this shape of being some shared view of the two, which I guess is a little bit of it, what it is, but or a communication translation. And sometimes when we just pull that out and we say, well, how did we need a common way to talk about customer between the sales and marketing, but really what we've got is a new concept of how to reach customers that involves sales and marketing in a new sort of synergistic relationship. And if we model that thing and don't try to force the others to accommodate it or force it into just a translator, I don't know, there's all these possibilities, and I think we need to open ourselves up to more kinds of ways that these connections could happen and how we could address them. And that's one. The whole new subdomain that's at the... I'll tell you a specific example, which I experienced back in the, early 2000s. And at this time, one of the big trends, so we saw this kind of emerge multiple times, and it was supply chain was becoming such a big thing. And so whereas people had previously been looking at it as a kind of, well, how are we going to integrate this warehouse with this store's inventory, right? So we've got to integrate the inventories of the store and the warehouse. And it's just kind of a communication problem, a little bit of translation. And then people started saying, well, this is a supply chain issue. What we really want is to lift ourselves up and view those as just, different instances of of inventory and supplies and sinks for supply, and then really have a whole separate domain modeled in its own way to represent the whole supply chain. And that's an example, just one that I remember encountering multiple times back maybe 15 years ago. Of course, everyone's assimilated that now. That was what I was going to say.
Good.
Cool.
Thanks. You're welcome to stay, by the way.
I'll stick around a little.
So one thing that popped in my mind is the question that comes up mostly when I talk about DDD with people is, as soon as you move from that problem space to solution space and you start making these bounded contexts, and I think, Jabe, you talked a bit about that 3 cultures, right? Where the third culture is we change the way people behave. It's always, we also, by a bounded context, we need to change the way people speak, I guess, because that's what the bounded context does, right? Not just one way. It's also, we decide now that A means coffee in this particular problem. And I think that maybe goes into your question, Matt, where you say, should they be to our users, at least to our domain experts? I don't know. That's a question here.
So I'll take a whack at it first. One of the things you point out is, again, in kind of philosophy of design or design studies, what you're pointing at is something called ontological design. And ontological design is the way in which the decisions we make now about how something is will basically loop back and shape the decisions we can make in the future. So there's a looping here, a feedback of the decisions I'm making right now will shape the decisions I can make in the future, right? So one of the things about like designing a domain is that we are not just designing a domain, we are designing the conversations we can have about something, right? And I don't mean we're literally like, kind of outlining this is the type of statements we can make, but by defining a vocabulary and defining a domain and the relationships in things in a domain, we are I think, intentionally structuring future conversations in a way that limit the amount of kind of sideways things that can happen. Now, to the extent that you do that unconsciously, I think that can be quite dangerous, and it can lead towards exactly the types of things we see in things like technical debt, right? Like this idea that I wrote something down, and while writing it, I thought of a better way or a different way of thinking about the thing that I wrote down, but I have a written thing and the thing in my head now, and they don't quite match, right? That's maybe technical debt. With these domains, you could get bigger versions of that, right? Like whole teams in debt of kind of conceptual shifts that need to happen. And that's maybe one of the things to notice about ontological design is that we made the decisions about how we shaped this conversation. That doesn't mean we have to stick with them. We could change them, we could modify them, we could keep them evolving. And so one of the ways to kind of conceptualize that is to stop thinking of design as a problem and a solution, and thinking of design as the identification of a problematic situation, some situation that you want to modify, right? That's what you're doing. And then a proposal about how to change that situation, right? Where the proposal never becomes a solution, it's always just a proposal that you are always continuously reevaluating whether or not it works or not. So like a really weird way of saying this, right, is you can think of a chair as a solution for sitting at a desk, or you could think of a chair as kind of constantly always being like, would you like to sit like this today? This is a way you could sit. But every time you approach the chair is asking you that question, right? And that is a different way to think about design, because it means that every time you use something you've designed, you could reconceive of whether or not, should we modify the outcome that this design is pointing us towards, or should we modify the design itself? And that is a question I think that should remain at least in mind when we're kind of exploring the implications of decisions that we've made, design decisions we've made. And I'll just point out really quickly, that's because things like designing a domain are not based on some sort of mathematical logic that doesn't change, right? The logic that we use to define a domain is a bunch of oughts. We ought to talk about a customer like this. There's no mathematical reason why we're talking about it that way. It's a ethical, moral decision we made about how to talk about a customer, right? And so there's no reason that we can't revisit those things and understand how those implications play out.
I'd like to add something and totally agree with Jabe that especially with some of the conversations I've been having, design is really about what decisions that you make, and you are making them at different levels. So the kind of design decisions that I'm responsible for, yes, they're focused on the human behavior element and interaction with the system. I then defer to my technical experts to say, okay, we can support or we suggest, and that's a different set of design decisions, but they're all about decisions. And I think what happens, talking about the ubiquitous language and meaning, is that we crunch those two things together. Making a decision, anybody can, and everybody has some say. Then the expertise to execute on that decision or to make it concrete or create an outcome, yes, you do need a certain set of skills, but they are two completely separate things. And I think we forget that. And in reality, in most companies, the people who are making decisions never do the thing. And the people who do the thing don't necessarily make the decision. So I think I've now started being very clear about when I say design, do I mean the noun, the verb, or the adjective? And so this goes back to your question, Matt, about the ubiquitous. Yes, it's everywhere, but it does not mean the same thing if you don't, in a specific context domain. And it's important to put it in that domain and then say, what does this mean? What is the impact? And then what is the outcome? And I think that's one of the changes I've made to my thinking, having these conversations, but I could only have that out of domain or out of network, if you like. It would never have been a question that would have come up if I'm talking to somebody in the same, because we understand what that means. Our assumptions are the same. The meaning is the same. So that was an interesting thing that you said. So it's design decisions and then design making or outcome.
Thanks. So I have someone from the attendees that wants to talk. Chris, I will allow you to talk for a few minutes and ask your question or pitch in, whatever you want. And you should be unmuted now.
Yeah.
Hi, welcome.
Yeah, how's it going, everyone? It's conversation is moving around a lot of how I've been applying complexity science to design. And from a mathematical perspective, it's funny to me how it's often the mathematics gets pushed aside and how that shifted since I first got into mathematics even, and some of the problems that happen within that domain. Where I can be talking to an analyst, and as a combinatorist, we're using different words to describe the exact same thing. And one of us has to do a shift and get into the other one's vocabulary for it to be able to make any sense. And it's funny to me that that can happen between mathematicians, but it's because, in my opinion, as we move into socio-technical spaces, we move into complex domains, and you end up getting these fat tails where there's multiple valid domains to discuss whatever problem we're dealing with, and how we agree on that. And I've been noticing more fractal patterns with it as we move in from a more local domain into something global, and the level of precision we're talking with and the level of accuracy. And I think I've been having more luck stepping away from precision and just trying to speak accurately. The other day, I used the word spaces and put it in quotation marks and thought about it way too hard afterwards. But if really was it a vector space? Was it like R3? Was it a real domain in 3 dimensions, which is a pretty garden variety Cartesian coordinate plane to hand someone? And it really didn't matter. All of them were valid. We could do it in any of those. And it's funny to me how putting in a constraint like that automatically shifts the conversation and can alienate so many people that are trying to contribute towards it. So those are just some of the frustrations I've been having around this. I was interested to hear if y'all had any thoughts.
Thanks. Rebecca, you want to apply? So thank you for that. Rebecca, you want to apply, and I'm gonna mute you again. Thanks.
Yeah, Chris, I think about, well, all of these different meanings could apply and it really didn't matter. I'm thinking of a story of when the book I wrote on object design was translated to Japanese. We used the terminology in the book object neighborhood. And they said, well, in Japanese, there really isn't a concept of that directly maps. It could be a business community, it could be a residential area, but they all were different words. They weren't neighborhoods. And I said, well, you know, I kind of like the ambiguity that all of them could apply, because it depends on if you're talking about collaboration amongst business or neighbors that are like in residential neighbors. And so they had to just pick one because they were pinned down in writing, you know, their book and translating. So we had a lot of discussion around that. And it's the same thing in software. I mean, I hate to say it. We, you know, having multiple meanings for things doesn't compute. But if we're having a high level discussion, that ambiguity is actually kind of nice, but we have this sort of tension when we actually get down to implementing things, is that we don't have this sort of range of meaning.
Good. Does anyone want to react? I think you're muted, Eric.
So following on what Rebecca was saying about the usefulness of words with ambiguous meanings, I think one of the constraints, so, you know, my book and generally domain-driven design is focused on developing software. So it ultimately means we're going to create something that can run in a computer. And so to do that, of course, you have to squeeze out ambiguity to a degree that isn't natural for human communication. And that ambiguity, I suspect people could have eliminated a lot of the ambiguity in language by now if they had wanted to, but as Rebecca points out, it can be useful to have ambiguous words when you want to use those, and then you shift to more precise speech when you need to, hopefully. And so one of the constraints we operate under is that some of the time, but not all of the time, when we're talking, we're trying to work around something that we're going to ultimately solve with software. So that's a constraint, but we shouldn't let it apply to every conversation we have about everything and try to be precise like a programmer in all our conversations. That would undermine us. So
it's also the thing, what I use most, and I think Dave also said it, a lot of people say it, is, and I think you say it too, I change language deliberately when I'm doing modeling. So someone says A, and I'll change the wording and see, maybe that brings new ideas. So without change in language, you can't explore something new, and
you know,
I think that's important too. But for software, you need consistency. So there's a balance, right?
You know, you raise a good point. When I wrote that ubiquitous language pattern, and it's usually we talk about it as being a language that we, you know, use consistently through this context, and it's used in the software and so on. But the other aspect of the ubiquitousness of language was that we used language to explore the problem. So a lot of times I realize that when I'm talking with, say, people who work in the domain, and a lot of it is talking about their domain, but trying out different language to see if we can find ways of talking that actually make our communication clear, especially around the areas we need to improve with the software development. So there were deliberately altering the language, experimenting with different ways of saying the same thing, perhaps. So yeah, I mean, and it's at different levels. Sometimes it's just people talking to people, but then ultimately with an eye toward, of course, what we do, or I do, ultimately help write software. But yeah, it's not a static thing.
Rebecca used a phrase earlier, language hunting.
Oh yeah. That was a good phrase.
So I used to lecture a lot about ambiguity, and it's one of my favorite kind of topics. And one of the things I like to point out when I talk about ambiguity is that there's a reason we have the word vague and the word ambiguous. They're different, right? Vague language is like there is nothing concrete in the language. Ambiguous language is actually quite clear about some things and leaves other things up to later determination, right? So saying use one hand is ambiguous about which hand to use, but it's not ambiguous about how to use the object, right? So this kind of level of clarity, the question ends up being when we do these types of activities where we're using language, has at least partially to do with not being overly specific in a way that it costs more than it creates value, right? There's like a trade-off of being overly specific versus overly vague, right? So ambiguous can be appropriately ambiguous, can be a way, I like to think of like, sometimes I talk about ambiguous as being like a regex, right? Like the right regex captures the right things and the wrong regex either captures too much or too little. And what we're looking for in language is often the right level of regex, the right matching, right? And this spans over into like stories and narratives in general. It's not just language. Certain stories capture things in certain ways that allow you to kind of think through a temporal sequence in a way that you can actually shift it from one place to another, and it still retains that value. Whereas if you were overly specific about the narrative, it wouldn't shift anymore. You can't move it. So it sticks too much to the place that it started. So again, ambiguity, I feel like, is often the right amount of capture versus the wrong amount of capture, either over or underly specific.
So abstraction.
Yeah, that's right. A model can be anything and it can have any shape, and a model sometimes needs an ambiguous part. As Jessica was saying, that's part of what we mean by abstraction.
So it's so the thing here, I've been reading a bit in polarity management lately, and I see someone used the word accurate, and that triggered me a bit because accurate is okay, but it's not complete. It's two different things. I always picture the picture of the rabbit and the duck. So accurately, it's a rabbit for me, but it's not complete because someone else can see the duck. So there's a difference between accurate and completeness. Does that relate to this? So it was just popping in my mind. I was wondering, does that relate here in ambiguity or language or accuracy versus completeness as well?
So I used to do this exercise where when I did this ambiguous work and I used the duck rabbit, and what I would do is I would have an illustration. I had it custom made so you couldn't recognize that it was the duck rabbit, but it was half of the duck and half of the rabbit. And I would get handed out and I'd ask people, they'd have like a secret note, and they'd open up the note and it would either say, make a rabbit, or it would say, make a duck, or it would say, make halfway between a rabbit and a duck. And what I would point out to people at the end of the exercise is the people who were instructed to make it into a rabbit almost always made it into a rabbit in a way that they could not then make it into a duck. It could not be visualized as a duck later. The people who were told to make it into a duck made this thing into a duck, and it then could not be interpreted as a rabbit later. But the people who were like told like this could be a rabbit or a duck would often make these illustrations where you could try to figure out, I mean, they weren't always good artists, but you could try to see that they had tried to capture the intersection or the indeterminacy of the question visually. And so being overly explicit about your expectations up front without knowing really what you want will get you what you want up front, right? It'll get you specifically what you ask for in ways that I think is hard for people to comprehend sometimes.
Is that duck rabbit thing a common ground? Sorry, that was all.
I think it's a good example of a common ground, right? I do.
So you know, one of the things that I'm thinking about while we're having this discussion about, you know, this ambiguity is that every time we get an example of the way a word is used that we are unfamiliar with, and this goes back to even like not just little children learning words, it redefines our boundaries of meaning for that word halo. And so, you know, when I see that and I go, that's a dog, you know, or that's a swan, I didn't know they were black or whatever. So we may have this sort of archetype, you know, this thing that represents whatever, ducks or rabbits or whatever, but every time we're really observing a new one, our boundaries of meaning shift a little bit. They expand or they contract. And if I think about that, and I think about ubiquitous language, it's like, yeah, in programming, we have to tie things down at some point, but it's the discussions around it that we need to leave things open to possibilities. And then once you've locked it down into the making of the design, if we don't design it in a way that allows us to flex or change, we're kind of hosed. And that probably goes for the UX ideas too. I mean, it's not easy to sort of change a whole trajectory of things.
We just scrunch it up and throw it in the bin and start again.
Good.
But to Jabe's earlier point about the framing bias, these are one of the many things I think to note. The last time I counted, there was something like 112 known that it, regardless of the information that you show a person, is going to get filtered through all of these lenses that we know about, and we don't even know to what degree, because that depends on people's experience and knowledge and a whole bunch of things. So none of that is predictable, but we try and make an approximation. That's where you need the wiggle room. And then you keep sort of testing and checking and confirming and eliminating, and then eventually you'll converge. So the other thing as well is that we don't do divergence and convergence very well as human beings at the same time. A computer is looking for one point, and you can come from as many different directions as you like, not a problem. But tell me which point I need to converge to. We don't operate that way. So we're trying to actually marry two different worlds together and then develop a language and try and make that clear and then manage all of that change. And I think that some of that is why we are having this conversation from all the different domains that we're coming from, because I think we're beginning to realize that.
Good. So this took us 45 minutes for the first question. Great, nice discussion. So maybe this as a quick follow-up, right? And this is maybe a specific DDDer, but I think everyone can, of course, everyone can pitch in. But who decides, and this is someone from the attendees, who decides the ubiquitous language? It's the product owner, domain expert, developers. Do they brainstorm? Is it ubiquitous for software or organizations or all the organizations? I think most of that already we discussed here, I guess, right? But I just want to make this explicit, this question. I think Matt wants to react.
I'm trying to unmute myself. I just wanted to say that the question says to me that not everybody is clear about what we mean about ubiquitous language and bounded context, because the language is only ubiquitous within this boundary that you draw, right? And there may be multiple languages in a business, in a community of people working together on a shared problem. So when we say ubiquitous language, we don't mean that we're trying to define a common vocabulary that's going to work right the way across the business or right the way across the planet. we're defining a boundary within which it's safe to use a consistent language.
Yes.
And maybe we'll assume that everybody understands that, because it's a sort of...
Yeah, I think that's one of I think there's another possible misunderstanding embedded, or not exactly misunderstanding embedded in the question. I think that was one of the important ones. And also it implies that it's sort of, I think the goal is to make language exploration more collaborative. So part of the purpose of the ubiquitousness of the language is that we're having more people participate in that activity. So by the nature of that, then the decision-making becomes more diffused. We don't have one person who says, this will be the language. We have a group of people, interacting, and the language is sort of, ideally, sort of emerging out of that interaction. Of course, you do ultimately sometimes have decisions about, well, what are we going to put in the software? And I think different projects handle that differently. I wouldn't be too prescriptive, but the activity of exploring language within a context is, you're trying to spread the number of people who are participating in that.
Good. Thanks. So
I have one more thing, just because it's one of my favorite things in the world. There's this pattern that Christopher Alexander always uses. It's called, or doesn't always use, he mentions. It's called the Mosaic of Subcultures. And it's kind of, again, I'm trying to point towards this, like the way in which the boundaries of things and the intersections of things play against each other. And basically he says there's three different ways to think about a city. One is that you try to homogenize the whole city. So that would be Matt's, like, we're going to come up with a universal language and everyone's going to use it across the globe, right? That's just homogenization. And the other one is kind of a city of ghettos is what he calls it. And what he means by that is that you have a city where all the places of the city aren't safe. If you're from one part of the city, it's not safe for you to go to another part of the city, right? So maybe it's because the language changes or because of, territorial issues, right? And then he says that the ideal city is actually a mix of the two. It is a way in which one can live in a particular part of the city and have a deep understanding of some sort of rich cultural experience that is their cultural experience, but that they are capable of visiting other areas in the city without kind of fear, I guess is the wrong way to put this right now. But the point being that there's the boundaries are not rigid. Yeah. There's a modicum of comprehension between all of them and stuff like that. And so the idea of creating domains in this third way, this third idea is to say that it is important to have kind of localization, but it's also important to have what is generally referred to as a cosmological activity as well, which is the ability to kind of traverse from one place to another. And in design theory, this is called cosmopolitan vocalism. And it says that you can't be hyper-local, otherwise you get problems, but you also can't be universal. So globalism's never going to work either, right? What you have to have is a combination of these two theories working in parallel with each other. And if you had to choose one, what you want to choose to do is minimize the cosmological part of it to a minimal set of shared agreed on topics and maximize the local versions of it, because then you get some of the effects that we've been talking about, right? Which is that when you walk from one cultural spot to another cultural spot, one domain to another, you get maximum friction between the two without actually causing a dislocation, right? So you don't want it to be so conflicting that you can't move from one to the other, but you want it to be, unambiguous enough that you can actually get the conflict, that you can notice that there's friction here, and that friction can be usefully explored. I liked Eric's example of creating a third domain as a way of exploring those intersections, right? But without having clarity there, you get kind of mud. and you don't get the conflict to arise in a productive way, I guess. Anyway, it's a useful pattern for thinking through things. I think I really have always enjoyed it when we talk about kind of cultural or linguistic things that we share locally and globally.
Yeah, this basic difficulty of thinking in two ways at once, like Don was raising this issue with a different pair of things, that people have a hard time thinking, like it used to be, we were always talking about, should we design bottom up or top down? And of course we should do both, but it's really hard to do both at the same time. And Don, what was the one you were saying? Don?
It was about riffing off of what Jabe had said, converging and diverging.
Yeah, converging and diverging. And here we're talking about this globalist view versus the localist view. I think there are a lot of these false dichotomies that we have to, it's hard for humans.
So the thing you explained, Jabe, and what you just said about that friction, reading some anthropology's book, and there was 2 Dutch anthropologists in the Netherlands, they call it classically a marketplace, where you exchange goods between these different areas. So cultures in the world, you go to a marketplace and they say, well, you exchange good, you exchange beliefs, you exchange, back then, of course, marriages between each other. And that was classically, does it represent what you say, a marketplace where you can...
Yeah, I would say that yes, and that's not only the only way I would explain it. I have a particularly expansive economic theory. So I think that if you think of a marketplace as being a classical Adam Smith Invisible Hand of the Market version of a marketplace, or if you consider it only as like a governmentally shaped marketplace, like a set of rules that a government puts in place, I think you miss what's commonly referred to as the commons, or a place in which we can work together to create something that we share in common. And I think that last one, which is represented by things like for instance, like a communal stove, which is a common occurrence in like English villages up until the Industrial Revolution, was a place where instead of, there's not enough, we chopped all the woods down to make ships, so there's not enough wood left. So not everybody can burn their own wood. So we'll make a stove in the middle of town and we'll light that, and then everybody can bring their bread out to be cooked in the commons stove, right? That also creates a community around it, around maintaining that thing, fueling it, talking to each other about like, how's your bread going, all that type of stuff. And I frankly think like all of that theory, that commons theory, when we talk these days are about like creating platforms and creating domains, on top of platforms that end up being a shared workspace, a place where people work together. That type of market, I think, is exactly the type of thing that I would like to see more organizations get better at. And I don't think very many are very good at it, because I think that most organizations have a tendency to either adopt property rights, as in the single wringable neck theory of product ownership, which is everybody at least says that's a bad idea these days, but it used to be something people said all the time. Like, so who is responsible for this thing? Or the opposite of that, like which governing body is responsible for this, like ITIL style, highly process oriented control theories. This third place, this way of saying like, how do we create common language? How do we create ways of sharing things together? How do we create a platform where we can work together on common things? That sharing aspect of what you're pointing at is exactly the type of stuff that I think is really critical in organizations these days.
Yeah. Matt, you want to respond?
Well, yeah, so talking of anthropology, right, and different tribes communicating with each other, I want to sort of bang the BDD drum a little bit and think about like, so when we talk about domains, and Eric talks about the sales department and the marketing department and them intersecting, and that's like one of the breaks between communities in an organization, right? But then the other break that we have is between the people who face towards the business problems and have the money and the resources, and then the people who face towards the technology and have the solutions. And there's a break there as well, isn't there? And how we communicate there is really important. Even just within a single domain, like trying to just find a space where we can collaborate and we can learn from each other and have the communication going both ways. Because that's a thing that often I see doesn't happen, is that, the engineers just get told what to do. And there's no feedback going the other way going, well, that might be really hard, or maybe there'd be a way we could do it like this that would be a lot easier, but you could still get a lot of the value, or, so that kind of like finding that common space, but just within a single domain, within a single department or silo, but just from business and technology. That feels like a common piece of ground between these three practices, is that's what we're trying to engage with and have happen.
Yeah. I heartily agree with what Matt just said. And I'd throw in one other thing, which is that the user interface design and the design of the underlying logic of the system is one of those big divided up things that, and that's one of the reasons that this particular topic interests me that we're having today, because it's explicitly saying, hey, let's look at user interface, UX and DDD. DDD has mostly been applied behind the scenes or behind the curtain or whatever. And I've always felt like that is not right, because the place where the language of the domain reaches the people that actually work within it is through the user interface, through the UX. If you miss that piece, if you don't bring the whole thing together somehow, then
that's what Don in the last meetup says, right? We forget the people.
Well,
we forget the people, but it's a shame, because it's a what you're saying, Matt. It's usually also a social ranking where people with the money has more power.
Yeah.
And I've seen multiple layers of this where I got a frustrated developer who says, well, I want to actually write with this. It was for the fire department. Can I just write with them, see what their experience? And then the analyst will say, no, that doesn't make sense. And I was like, and I think that's, we discussed it last time. Things like DDD and BDD work, in my opinion, if you create that loop between UX and also between business and domain experts, so that you have the common ground. Yeah. And not just try to lower that social ranking.
And I'd even say it's a failure mode where we try and bring these things in because we want the benefits, but we don't have that social context, and people are still getting told what to do. And the people right down at the bottom of the pecking order are the QAs who actually know what it does, and nobody listens to them except if they fire a JIRA ticket.
And I like to just really quickly point two things. One, exactly what Matt just said, that it's extracted from the social context. So this is the problem to me of defining a problem. Because a problem is a statement that's extracted from a social context and says, if we solve this thing, then we put it back in the social context and it'll be better. It'll be fine, right? The whole point is to say of design is to say, like, the problematic situation, you can't extract pieces from it. It's just like any reductionistic thinking. You can't pull the thing out and modify it over here and then stick it back in, right? You have to actually integrate that social context into the work, right? And that's the second thing I wanted to point out, which is not, the naive version of a lot of this stuff is to just have like a multi-talent team, multi-expert team, whatever, like all these homogenizing words about like, just put everybody on the same team. But that doesn't tend to work very well, right? And in particular, because your customers are never going to be on your team. They're, your customers. That doesn't mean you can't work with them. But if you can't figure out how to work across these social boundaries in productive ways, you can't work with your customers well. And so if you can't figure out how to work across these social boundaries within your organization to create a common space to work within the organization, What hope do you have of actually going and trying to work with people who nobody can tell them to do the work anymore? So like that's the fallacy of some of this hierarchical ways of thinking about organizing things and property ownership and contrasting that against commons theory is to say that one of the most important parts of developing and delivering software is a group of people who don't report to anyone inside your organization at all. They're your customers. They don't report to you. If you want to work with them to figure out how to create a common space that they want to participate in. Anyway, that's me ranting, and I'll stop now.
Great. So let's move on to the next one, and maybe this is a nice bridge with all these subcultures and everything, because the one that says here, does the concept of subdomains map to anything from the UX world? If not, would this be useful? Do we first need a set or ask Eric what he exactly means with subdomains before we can dive into?
Well, I mean, okay.
The unambiguous, definitive, precise definition.
Yeah,
precise.
So thank you, Rebecca. Because
Accurate.
I remember a couple of years ago at DDD Europe or someplace, I was arguing for a certain degree of ambiguity in the definition
You were.
of things.
Quaint domains, you gave different adjective phrases.
Well, that was
that too.
about different kinds of bounded contexts. I guess that was.
Okay. No, yeah, that was context.
When I was talking about how there are some things that are defined very precisely and without ambiguity, and some things that have a lot of ambiguity, I think I used I said, well, like in DDD, we talk about, if you read far enough back, there's closure of operations, which I took from math, and it's a very, very unambiguous kind of thing, closure of operations. And then at the other extreme, I said happiness. So let's say we were trying to define happiness unambiguously, and I can think of all kinds of terrible things that would happen if we really did do that, because of course we'd all optimize it. So in between there somewhere is DDD, but subdomains, I'd say, somewhat more definable than that. I mean, so subdomain is part of a domain, right? If you're in the domain of shipping, then part of shipping is logistics. So logistics is a subdomain of shipping, or, but of course, subdomains then by their nature are kind of things that are defined according to convenience. So the shipping domain, you could say, is kind of a real world thing, but saying, well, the operations, looking at the operations in a port is not really, I have just chosen to say, I'm going to look at all the operations in ports and understand what's involved in those activities. That's going to be one of my subdomains, whereas, the planning of the route is going to be another one. But I could have drawn the boundaries any way I wanted to, right? And there are conventional boundaries that come up in these companies. And so those conventional boundaries start to feel like a part of the business. Well, they are way part of the way the business is done. So that if you went into shipping and said, I'm so innovative, I don't acknowledge that there are these conventions that we typically divide the port operations from the, the things. Well, there's a usefulness. So this is part of the commons, I suppose, of that industry. So the subdomain, the concept of that is wrestling with this basic difficulty of saying, comprehending the entire shipping business as one thing is much too much. No human mind could encompass all that. And so we have to break it down, and we have to look at it as a set of subdomains, a collection of parts that partially overlap with each other, maybe, and can be redefined as the business evolves, or in different contexts even. Whereas a bounded context was meant to say, here is a little island of order, of unnatural order, almost like saying, within this group of people and in this activity, usually a piece of software as we're applying it, within this part of the software. We're going to have very strict definitions of things, not total elimination of ambiguity, but a lot less than you'd have broadly, and consistency. But the subdomain thing, therefore, does seem a little slippery. I think that's in that category of things that need to be a little loose. Does that help? I don't know if I've clarified or just said lots of words. I know
if I can take an attempt, Eric, the first thing that jumped in my head was abstraction. Because if it's inside, let's just say it's inside a box, and then this is a subsection somehow, there's an interface that you can then describe either mathematically with coordinates or something, then it's an interface, and therefore it's an abstraction within that domain. Would that be an appropriate way of thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, in the sense that I do think subdomains are an abstraction. That is, and therefore is something, you know, created in some mind, and therefore, you know, we can change it in our mind. So in that sense, I agree. So as I mentioned earlier, you know, to say, well, shipping to a degree is real. I mean, you can actually see physical things happening. If you take the activities, which are all connected to each other, but if you take them and subdivide them, those subdivisions you've made are somewhat arbitrary. They're abstract, well, they're ways of abstracting the business. So now I'm not looking at thousands of individual people loading boxes onto ships. I'm looking at port operations. And I chose to do that and not break it down into smaller pieces and not into bigger ones or overlapping ones. I could have had, I mean, then there are overlapping ones because the operation of the ship and the operation of the port overlap each other, for example. So yeah, it's an abstraction. I mean, I could take a shot at relating it to the user, to UX, because when we are creating the user interface of a software system, we're thinking about a group of people who are going to use it for certain activities. And that does play close to subdomain, I think. Like in my port operations example, let's say we'll have some sets of interfaces that are for the people who are working in ports, and or just for the people who are coordinating with the ports. Let's say we're a shipping company, because I used to work on a software system for shipping companies, so I know something about it. And so, you know, there's a whole area of complexity in a category. So the people whose job it is to do this kind of activity, you could define a subdomain that way, and you could say, so they have a set of UIs, right? And,
yeah, but I think for an experience, it's more than just UIs. It's also the things that happen in between.
Okay.
So
yes.
when you are mapping, and that's why you can't use the interfaces to describe, because they are one of the steps. So if you just relied on the interfaces, you're not mapping the entire experience. And okay, if you want to be really obtuse, you would start with somebody comes in through the front door in the morning and sits on their chair and then turns the computer on and then waits for it and has their coffee. And all of that happens before the login screen or whatever it is even turns up. But that has an impact, and you're mapping all of that. So you want to streamline, or you want to have what I call an opinionated experience, where there is a minimum number of steps that someone can execute in order to achieve the outcome that they want to achieve. And that's before, during, and after the interface, but it's still in the space of the domain of shipping. That's why I asked you what was a subdomain, because I was struggling with figuring that out. So it's almost like if the subdomain is a piece of chocolate. I have some Toblerone on my desk. The experience is the wrapper around the entire thing, which is Toblerone has, you know, those edges with air. They don't just wrap the chocolate, they wrap the whole thing, including the air, and ship that.
Okay.
So that's what an experience would entail. But the actual interface is actually that angular, triangular thing with gaps in it.
Okay, so let me ask you, because that's intriguing, but it's kind of an abstract, let me see if I can. So I'm going to lay out a more specific scenario, and then you can tell me, like, what would these different aspects you were talking about be like? So suppose that the goal of this person, you said they have this ultimate goal in mind. They want this to happen. So we want, say, certain cargoes, to be loaded onto a certain ship. And that has to be planned out. We have to identify the right people in the port that are going to do that work. We have to give them a sequence to load in so the stuff gets stacked in the right way. And I'm sure there are lots of tasks involved, but maybe that's enough already, right? So we know the ship, we know which company in the port we want to have do this work. We have to figure out the sequence of loading and tell them, I don't know, that kind of stuff. So now tell me, how do these concepts that you were talking about, because I agree that UX is much more than a screen with buttons on it. But the thing you were saying to me was so abstract that if you could connect it to something like a story, like I was saying.
Okay, so let's take the loading, right? So how involved does somebody need to be? Are they going to carry those things? No, right?
Certainly not the person we're talking about who's at a computer.
Right. So they have to identify, because I'm sure there's sort of some kind of schedule or contract or something that has been agreed somewhere to say that that particular box is going to turn up, is going to leave New York and turn up at, I don't know, San Francisco on Wednesday or something. So in the system, you already have, the person doesn't have to calculate how far the box needs to go. They don't have to calculate, all the other logistical aspects. Somebody
did that, but they've already done it.
Right. So for the, let's just say for the purposes that they need to just get it earmarked and loaded. There might be some approval. So there's a decision that has to be made. It can go or it can't. That's really the ultimate reason why you would involve somebody. Otherwise, you'd just automate the entire thing, right? So there's some decision. What is that decision? What information do they need to make that decision? How many people are involved, and what parameters do they need? I'm being very hypothetical now because I can't think of something particular. Let's take a family who's moving. They're relocating from one side of the country to another. Therefore, typically what a business would do, if that's a few days late, yes, they will be upset, but if they had to weigh against a corporate customer and an individual, you're going to lose as an individual. These are the sort of pieces of information that person who's making that decision will make. Then it probably has to then be approved, and then eventually that thing goes on or it doesn't.
Okay, so that's an interesting, so let's say that most of this process is automated and it comes down to the ship's a little overbooked. We have to decide to bump a few things. Probably the system automatically bumps some stuff and it brings it down to this little set of like edge ones. Which are we going to bump?
Yeah.
And maybe that's the sort of thing you're talking about.
So
and
that
now
could be one.
They bring their human intelligence to it.
Yes. But we would map all of that, and that decision, there is a place for them to make it, but it's actually happening in their heads. And we have to supply them enough information so that they can make an informed decision. Like, no, whatever you do, this might be 1K over, but this guy is going to cost us $1 million in dollars if we don't deliver his favorite cactus on on Friday.
Right.
And part of the problem that I see with automation is that people do the machine bit and then forget about that, the decision making. So it makes it 1 million times worse. And then everybody says, sorry, computer says no. No, it didn't say no, it didn't say anything. So that's the, so in terms of a subdomain, the way that, at least from an experience standpoint, we would approach it is that we'd be looking for those sort of aspects in terms of, okay, for this particular decision or for this particular problem, as Jabe said, what's the in, what's going to happen, what's the out, and who is that for?
Yeah.
I think another way of like thinking about it a little bit is like if we reframed it as a question, if you ask an IA a question about subdomains, what they might start talking about is like users are looking for something. They're looking for something, right? They're you can think of it, it's called the berry picking problem. Like they're out, they're in your software and they're like trying to find valuable things in the software. They're searching for things, right? So they're actively engaged in this, like, what do I need right now? What information do I need? And what features what functions do I need right now to accomplish what I'm doing, right? And you can imagine that, like, if I were to think through your subdomain theory, if I provided you somehow with an interface that was just the entire domain all at once, it would be the same thing as being like, there's berries in the forest, go find them, right? By subdomaining, we're saying like, oh, you're looking for blueberries? Here is a blueberry patch, right? Yeah. We've limited what the search space down so that as a user, your experience is kind of nice. Like, oh, I'm able to like gather the things that I need in order to do the work that I'm doing. And I didn't even know what I was looking for necessarily, but the software has led me down a path to help me understand what I want, right? So that's kind of an IA or a search theory version of it from design. Another version of it might be like an HCI version of it, which I always think about BDD and HCI sometimes. I also like to think about this a little bit with the book that just got released, Team Topologies, right? HCI has this theory that says like when a user is using software, you should be able to measure the amount of energy or brain wavage that they're using, right? So that how much activity is going on in their mind, and better software would lower the cognitive load, right? It literally, one of the ways to measure good design in HCI is it lowers your cognitive load, right? So I'm not a super fan of that particular concept, but I would say that one of the things that I keep on bumping into when I explore DDD or some of these other ideas like team topologies or microservices is this idea of like sizing the space so that you can it is optimal for you to have a cognition about, right? To think about, right? And if it's too big, it tends to be hard to think about. If it's too small, it tends to be like you spent too much effort making it too specific, maybe. So I think these subdomains could be like about, from a designer's perspective, about designing the interface or designing the experience in cognitively right-sized amounts so that people could actually have a thought about it as opposed to having too much stuff on the screen, for instance.
Yeah, I'd like to comment on that because I think that is the most direct application of subdomain to UX. I think that what a subdomain is ultimately is a portion of the domain, and why do we have those? So that we can think about part of it and clump together things that are related and tell stories within a sort of logical subset of the whole thing. If I would say that, of course, if, you know, as you pointed out, if the subdomain is too big, then it's too much to think about, too much cognitive load. When it's too small, I wouldn't argue that we've spent too much time making it small. I would say that you can make it small to the point where a person cannot think about their problem within a single one of these boxes. So then they have to look at the totality again, and they're right back where they started. So making things too small or drawing the boundary in the wrong place so that I can't really think through part of my job without looking outside of this little space that you've made me adds to my cognitive load. I would furthermore say that this is part of, you know, we're talking about users of the software. But another important dimension of this is how do the software development team members think about it? And they have a cognitive load too. So a good design is one that the developers can think about and really get their heads around. And that's in terms of how you break it down, which is part of the subdomain thing, because it leads to modules or whatever. But also, what concepts do you use? Are they concepts that are easy to use and powerful, but in nice ways? Or are they awkward, clumsy, and with a multiplicity of different concepts you have to use? This is the same when Don and I were talking a few minutes ago, and we were talking about how does this impact the users, and they have some goal, and we're all about what is that goal, and what are all those steps along the path from where they start to where they accomplish the goal and so on. But the same is true under the covers, I think, or even applying these principles, the concept of subdomain itself. Why did I talk about that concept? It wasn't just because I thought, oh, here's an interesting concept. It's because when I'm trying to make certain kinds of design decisions, related to the point that Don was making about start by thinking about the decision that user has to make and all that goes around it. Well, what's the decision that a designer has to make? Designers have to make certain decisions. And I find that this subdomain concept helps me think through certain decisions. One that I talk about a lot, which is not very UX oriented, I don't think, but it's more on the strategic end, is when I'm looking at this subdomain, does it seem quite generic? Is this one where we can probably get some kind of off-the-shelf solution, or at least draw upon general knowledge from outside to find the solution? Or is this some really special thing that's this is our cutting edge thing we're figuring out, and could we distill that? And, and other possibilities as well. That I find subdomain to be a useful concept when I'm trying to do that. I try to sort of shape, I talked about conventional subdomains in an industry, but when you're starting to work on it, you can develop new ways of breaking the domain down. And suppose you say, this special sauce, this special differentiator that you're talking about is all mixed together here with some quite generic things, that if we could tease these apart, if we could find a way to talk about a subdomain that was really very generic, and let's draw upon outside knowledge for that, versus this very special thing, which will now be distilled more clearly. So that's the kind of usefulness that I apply the subdomain concept to. And I would imagine that it would have application at UX level, but I don't know. But there's my motivation anyway.
I have one question. One thing that I noticed that I think is interesting to talk about, kind of the difference between a category and what we're calling a subdomain, or what you're calling a subdomain. And the thing that I'm wondering about, it reminds me of conversations I had with Jessica. I suspect that you could find the same concepts, ideas in multiple subdomains, and that's not problematic. It's very different than categorization is an activity where all the things have to go into one bucket or the other, right? They belong in one place and only one place. And from a design perspective, one of the reasons that's interesting is because often when you're designing a menu section, sometimes the answer is it doesn't matter whether or not you duplicate the thing in multiple menus. It matters if the user expects it to be there or not. If the user expects it to be there, it's in the right place. So I'm wondering a little bit about the way, whether or not domains are different than categories in that way, or whether that's just a weird side thing that I think about, or if that's something useful to notice.
My 2 cents is that domains, subdomains, and categories are 2 different things, but they both could have the same item in them. 2 subdomains could overlap. I don't think 2 bounded contexts could overlap, because that violates the very idea of them. If I say everything within a bounded context is basically consistent, and everything within this bounded context is basically consistent, well, if they overlap, then they have to be consistent throughout. which means they're one bounded context, right? So overlap within it is a contradiction with the concept, but not with subdomain. I mean, when I think of category, I think of it really more like the abstractions we're building are often categories. Like an example I use sometimes is like, you know, the Sesame Street game, since we're talking about ducks and geese and whatever, ducks and rabbits. So let's say they gave, you know, which of these things does not belong? There's a rabbit and there's a duck and there's a table and there's a, you know, a cow. And they're supposed to say, okay, the table doesn't belong because all the other things are animals. But they could have said that the duck doesn't belong because it's the only thing that has 2 legs versus 4 legs. So there are 2 categories that you could use, at least 2, that you could use to decide which of these things is in its own category. And you're supposed to pick the category, I don't know, basically you pick the category that has the most utility. We generally find the animal versus inanimate object category to be an extremely useful distinction, whereas the things with 4 legs versus things with 2 legs, when it's applied, especially when it's applied outside of animals, doesn't seem that useful. So, you know, so it's like training little domain modelers to say, I can recognize which category is the most powerful model to use.
So that's one reason why I actually favor characterization over categorization, which means I want, if I'm trying to be innovative or look at things in a different way, if I want to just, you know, nail it down in code, that's a different matter. But characterizing things so I can see different ways of seeing is actually a pretty powerful technique.
I agree 100%. Even when you're nailing it down in code, you can still use characterization instead of categorization a lot.
Yeah.
This is another, it's kind of related to the composition versus hierarchy approaches to, you know, do I want to relate things through hierarchies and of inheritance, or do I want to relate them by composing elements to make new things?
Yeah, so I think something that you said, Eric, which is interesting, is the perspective or context is always different, and that's where there's the tension. For a system, it has a certain way of being and a certain way of working and operating, and people are infinite. And we're trying to figure out how many of those infinite possibilities match most. So it's a probability game to some extent. And part of doing the user research is that you basically nullify, if they're in the same culture, the same company, the same data, you can ignore a bunch of variables, right? And then boil it down to the ones that you want to handle. So it's always, for me, it's like a probability deduction, because there is always that element of risk that your interpretation did not quite match the expectation of your users, and the way you course correct that is with the feedback, and that's why you have that continuous loop. So the thing that you said about having generic usable behavior is typically we'd start with accepted industry heuristics that we have documented. The problem with that is that it could no longer be applicable. You know, it's either fallen out of fashion or favor or whatever, or it just doesn't apply to that particular group. So there's always this element of elimination that you're kind of going through and say, it's not that one, it's not that one, it's not that one, it's not that one, it's not that one. Ah, it might be that one. And then you radiate around that and then confirm it. So I don't actually approach a problem saying, okay, which generic or which reference model is it going to, because people just are not that predictable. I'm looking for the things that I can eliminate safely with low risk, and then look at what I have left. So it's a bit like being Sherlock Holmes, you know, eliminate, and whatever's left, that's your answer.
That's really very practical in the sense that we don't have an infinite search space. We have to, in some sense, what you're saying, Don, and I'd be interested in hearing you react to this, is by eliminating sort of outliers, I'm satisficing in a way that I feel more comfortable with.
It's actually, to some extent, Rebecca, the opposite, right? Just because someone's, let me just clarify what you meant by outliers. I'm looking for those. Those are, I'm looking for all possible behavior that would match. So they're not an outlier for me, they're a match. The ones that don't exhibit or don't show up, I'm not, that we could make software for them, but those people don't exist in that population and will therefore never use that functionality that eventually that we are designing. So
okay, so I was using outlier as those that wouldn't match. Okay. So we're
so we're in agreement. So because I approach a problem knowing that there's this infinity, and if I don't respect that, then I'm in trouble from the beginning. So that's the starting position. Whereas there's certain things that about a computer. There is a limitation to what it can and can't do. And there may be aspects of that experience where the best place to do that is in a computer. There may be aspects of that experience where the best way to do it is to ask someone a question and make them give you back a decision. You might give them some information, but don't ever do that in a computer.
Right.
But collect the answer and put it into a computer.
One of your points seems to be, or at least a corollary of it would be then, and I think this is important, is to think about in this design process, think about which of the tasks that have to be done should be done by a computer and which of them is really a better job for a human, and where those two meet, like how they, because really there are, the best software I've seen has a very nice blending of what humans are good at and what computers are good at and gets them to kind of work together.
So you're saying the software is not overly ambitious?
Yeah, not over automating things that are better left to human judgment.
I've been reading a bit of Simon Sinek, Leaders Eat Last, and we can trust people because I can make rules and a computer always abide by the rules if we do it correctly, right? However, I can trust someone, and the example he gave was in aviation, where there's a rule that you need to stay within so much feet with the other aircraft. So if there are aircrafts on top of each other, they cannot pass like this. And at some point, the upper aircraft was in trouble, and the air traffic controller was actually saying, well, you move here, you move there, you go down. But that's actually breaking the rules. But we could trust that person to break the rules because they know what they're dealing with. A computer would never do this because the rule is this. A computer will never break that. Yeah. Right? So what a computer is good for giving information, sometimes making decisions. And Abiba can talk a lot about AI and the problems with the biases in AI.
I think
let a computer do.
Yeah, Don had a nice example earlier with the shipping where we're shipping some household goods, and normally that might be lower priority if we have to bump something, lower priority than some of our big corporate customers or something. But the people happen to know that the owner of that is some executive of one of our big companies or something, and we really don't want to, piss them off. So we're going to be sure that cactus gets to the new house on time or something like that. I remember that she had that example. So that's a thing a computer would never come up with.
Yeah, I remember working on a system where we were using neural nets and machine learning to do capacity planning for passengers in airplanes and pricing of seats. And the one thing that the system could not deal with was events in the world that would change the situation. Like the Pope was coming somewhere, so he announces he's going there. That's going to increase the traffic or whatever. So the point is understanding the intersection of your assumptions about a system, and then that the world's events and can happen as well, is something that humans might need to override some certain things when they were doing the planning, because they knew about things that the computer could not know about. And if we don't build systems that are more like that, I think we're in trouble. Yeah.
So there's a set of theory from resilience engineering that I think is useful here. And the first is they have a concept that's called adaptive capacity. And all resilient systems have adaptive capacity. And that's the ability for a system to remain stable responding to unexpected events, right? So like how does the system restabilize after? And you can think of it like a budget, your adaptive capacity. If you hit some shock that completely consumes all of your adaptive capacity, the system's adaptive capacity, the system will fail, where failing is an interesting topic that we should talk about later. But basically, the system will no longer perform the way it's expected to perform, and therefore some event will happen, right? And that's all interesting, but the second part of that is that adaptive capacity is always provided by humans, not by machines, right? So machines have no adaptive capacity. It's the humans using the machines that have adaptive capacity. So the idea here is roughly, when you have a failure in your system, it's because the humans that were making the system, which is in continuous partial failure, right? Like systems are always failing, not always succeeding. If the humans weren't there, the system would collapse. So the humans are kind of constantly maintaining it, making sure it happens. At some point, some event happens where the humans are no longer able to make the system appear to be working anymore, and it collapses, right? So some interesting kind of side points of that end up being things like when you over-automate things for people, one of the problems with the over-automation is that it's an is simultaneously an act of de-skilling. So, in other words, humans only learn to react to situations by, reacting to the situations. So if you automate away all of their interactions with those situations, they don't understand how to react to them when they occur. The system is kind of shielded them from learning, right? So there's a balance point there about, hey, how do we kind of get that to work? And then the second one I thought that would be interesting to talk about was just the way in which kind of the domain-driven concepts that we're talking about are a form of creating adaptive capacity inside of an organization. By creating these mental models, we're literally creating a way that when there's a crisis, the people have a language to describe what's happening in the crisis better. They have a set of common ways of describing things, or explicit mental models as opposed to tacit mental models that looks something like common ground, the way that it would be described in resilience engineering. So I think there's a whole bunch of stuff to play with in there that's really interesting. And then the only last thing I'll say is, Toyota's autonomation concept as opposed to automation concept, I think is really useful here. And what basically during the late 70s, early 80s, the United States adopted robotics in almost all of their manufacturing plants, especially in automotive areas, and it ended up tearing them all up. And the reason that they put the robots in the first place was because Toyota had done it, and they wanted to follow Toyota. And what they ended up doing was radically de-skilling their work base and not being able to provide the cars the same way. And they went back and basically talked to Toyota later and said, like, how come you guys could use robots and we couldn't? And what they said was, well, we never automated away the tasks. We just augmented the humans. And that's a completely different mental model. And you guys totally didn't get it. Anyway.
So it sounds like open space offices in most enterprises.
That's
It
really,
works for one, and then everyone copied it.
an approach to software design that's like building an Iron Man suit, that you're building software that makes the things that humans want to do or need to do anyway, just making them stronger at doing those things rather than trying to just put them to sleep and have everything carry on without them even being consciously aware of it. Yeah.
Good. So
I think, also fully automating maybe the tedious routine stuff so that people don't have to do a lot of drudge work, and then taking the more odd cases, which are harder to automate anyway, and feeding those to humans, and then gradually taking the more routine ones of those and so on. And you've always got your humans looking at the weird cases. Although I must say, I've always encouraged people to, when they're modeling, to avoid focusing too much on the happy path, completely routine cases, because I think you get models that are just really rigid and not very useful out of that. So, but still, the really weird ones will throw you off too, and those are good for humans.
One of the things to explore is just that, Brian Arthur is another kind of guy who talks about this type of stuff. And one of the things he says is that if you go and look at, most people like to think that the software and technology that they're creating is for human beings, like it's for human needs. How much software do we create that is actually to serve technology's needs? Like it's not serving a human need. It's like a patch. It's something that we're putting in place because the other technology doesn't quite work. So we need to, there's a huge amount of technology that we built that doesn't directly serve any human need. It serves technology's needs. And so there's this weird kind of way in which automation gets automated, and then we automate the failure case of that particular automated system, and we just keep on building and building and building on that. And I guess the question ends up being to some extent, when are we all kind of working more for technology than for our own needs, and how do we identify that balance when we automate things? And so that's just something to be careful of, I guess.
I'm reminded of release train engineers making pipelines, but besides that, so we're running almost to our ending of this meetup. I think we discussed 3 questions out of a lot of it, so I think I will plan another one in 2 months, send out another thing. But to check out, I have there's one question. Each and everyone can decide for themselves in a few sentences. So of all these practices, where should a typically unenlightened team start? So what can they do tomorrow? So if someone is not enlightened about these practices, or, well, maybe the simplest question, of course, is start with the people, but where should an unenlightened practice start? So Rebecca, would you like to do the first, since you're on top of my screen?
Oh, okay. I'm saying, why do I get?
So we're gonna go round again.
Yeah, I actually think talking about intention and sharing language and meaning, it could be done in a very practical way, so that if you're starting to try to marry UX design with business developers and whatever, just having conversations and meaning about a particular area of the system that you want to create is a good place to start. And I think that having that conversation across concerns, business to domain to UX people, and just learning each other's language by having a discussion about it would be a good place to start.
Good, thanks. Jape, you're next on my screen.
I always have this one thing that I always suggest when people are asking how to do something new, and it usually has to do with just noticing something, right? Like just pay attention and notice a particular thing. And in this case, I feel like The thing I would want people to notice is when they have to translate from one domain to another without even knowing what a domain is. Like when I talk to a customer, they call it X, and in the software it's called Y. I'm using like a lot of mental activity to juggle these two terms in my head all the time. Is that good or bad? And how many other people in the organization, when I say to them like a stock item, do they go, oh, you mean like a thing on the shelf? Like just literally noticing those translations is the beginning to me of understanding the value of having kind of consistent language and domains in the first place. So until you notice the problem, I don't think adopting the practice is the first step, but that's just me.
Thank you. Jessica, you're up next on my screen.
And continuing on that point as another means of moving toward an agreed upon language. Dawn said something very early on. It's about giving people the opportunity to ask a stupid question without looking stupid. So one thing you can do is just start asking really stupid questions, because you think it's a stupid. You're not the only one who has that question, or somebody else thought that they knew what that word meant and they didn't know either. So making that safe.
Thank you. Dawn, you're up next.
I put it in the Miro board. This is something that I would definitely advocate. Or everything everybody else has said, and then put all of that in a controlled vocabulary, because I don't remember what I did 3 hours ago. So how am I supposed to remember something that is brand new that I'm just learning? And then you have a reference where you can go back, and then that begins to make the commons language for whatever that domain and that space is. And it's just a key value pair, Richie. This is the word, and then obviously there may be one or many equivalents, and then define the meaning, and then just keep that up through the project. So that's at a practical level, everything else that everybody else has said, and then start building that together as an entire team. It's not owned by design or development or product management. Everybody contributes and uses that as a reference.
Thanks. Matt, you're next.
Yes, it's my question, wasn't it? It was quite intimidating trying to sort of sum up everything I've heard. I think I want to encourage people to tell each other stories, or listen for when people are telling each other stories about real people interacting with the system, and look for examples, so real concrete examples of how people are using the system, and try and listen for those words that are being used in those examples, hunt for that language, and then start to do this feedback. So either, like somebody said earlier on, try using a different word and see if it jars and somebody corrects you, or see whether people like that word better. But to test the language as you start, and feed it back by writing it down, like Dawn suggested. It could just be on a whiteboard with post-it notes, or you could draw a context map and start to kind of build that model. You could write a feature file, but start to consolidate it a little bit and get feedback on it. But I think the first thing is just listening to people and listening to them talking about real examples, and then just starting to try and feed it back.
Thanks. Great. John, you're up next.
So what Matt said, obviously. Also, I like to get people, and what everyone else said as well, about the conversations. We get people to have conversations about the end. So start with the end, start with the outcomes. Try and figure out what the real goals are, and then drill into that and figure out what the goals behind the goals are, until everyone gets an actual vision of what you're trying to achieve, even at whatever level you're having the conversation, whether it's at a particular application or a specific part of the application, and then work backwards from the goals and talk about, give me an example of how that would play out to get this particular goal, or what about this goal, what about this variation. So yeah, start with the outcomes. That'll be my sort of one-liner and piece of advice after everyone else's great contributions.
Thanks. Eric.
Since I'm last, all the ideas are all used up. So now all I can say is I agree with most of those things. But I think I would advocate, I'll say this because this, when I'm actually involved in a project, is almost always what I'm saying we need to do first. And it's sort of like what Matt was saying about getting the concrete examples in front of us of what we really do, except it's a slightly different thing where I say we need some concrete stories, some concrete business scenarios. This is a little more than how people interact with the system. It's like the goal that John was talking about. But how do you get from like, well, here's a problem that's arisen in the business. And then, and when I say scenario, I mean a specific story, not this is one, branching, multi-branching thing. Specific story, it can be a real story. That's sometimes the best. This situation arises in the business and people then encounter this problem and they have to make a decision. And here's the decision they made. And then this happened. And if you put that whole chain together that leads to whatever that goal was, then you can really talk about concretely like questions of, well, what language should we use to express this story? You can't tell a story without a language to tell it in. And are all these things that the computer should be doing? Which parts of this really are the part that would be automated, really valuable automation? Or I just find that a lot of times we talk too abstractly about the problems and about the solutions to those problems. And when I am advocating modeling as a thing we should do, that's even more abstract. So the bringing it down to those concrete stories. And then I know it's supposed to be just one thing, but remembering that these things are really hard to do. So don't get frustrated too easily. Maybe you try doing the story, the scenarios first, and you just don't get anywhere. And maybe then you try, one of the other things that some of these people have suggested, and well, let's try that for a while. And you find the thing that gives you some traction. It's not it's really difficult stuff to do. So don't get frustrated.
Don't get frustrated. Thank you, everyone. It was a really nice conversation again. And
thank you, Kenny.
Thank you all for being here.
Yeah.
I learned.
And look at us being resilient. We can't get together physically.
Yeah. So I'm going to close the screen, but before the stream. So before I do that, remember next week we have a next session. Dawn and Rebecca will actually be there. We're going to talk about upfront design versus iterative design and how do we actually balance that. So join us next week on Thursday, and you can continue the conversation on virtual DDD on Slack. There's a link on virtualddd.com, and hope to extend this conversation later. Yeah. And thank you all for coming and joining and asking questions.